You hear it first at 2 in the morning. A soft, persistent scratching behind the drywall on the north side of the bedroom, then droppings in the cabinet under the kitchen sink, then a bag of rice with a hole chewed clean through the corner. And you're standing there at midnight holding a flashlight, trying to calculate how long this has been going on without you noticing. You call an exterminator. They come out, set a few snap traps, seal a gap or two with a wad of steel wool, and hand you a quarterly contract for $189 a visit. They will be back in 90 days to check the traps, back again 90 days after that. Because if they solved your rodent problem permanently, you would never call them again. And they already know that. Now picture a farmhouse in Chester County, Pennsylvania, built in 1887. The family that has farmed that land for 5 generations has never once called an exterminator, never set a commercial trap, never used a bait block, never bought a single bottle of anything from the pest control aisle. And they have never had a rodent inside that home or barn. Not a mouse, not a rat, not a vole working through the garden. The reason is growing 6 inches underground around the perimeter of their property right now. It has been growing there, undisturbed, since their great-great-grandmother put it in the ground in the 1880s. The root is called calamus, Acorus calamus, sweet flag. Before the chemical pest industry spent 5 decades making sure you never learned its name, it was the single most widely used rodent deterrent on North American and European farming properties. A bag of dried root costs $4 at any herb or aquatic nursery. A living division you can plant yourself costs nothing if you know someone who already grows it. And once it is in the ground, it works without a single additional dollar from you, for the rest of your life and the life of whoever inherits the property after you. By the end of this video, I'm going to show you the 1908 Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture bulletin that documented calamus root as the primary rodent deterrent on plain community farms in Lancaster, Lebanon, and Chester counties. The Ohio State study from 2003 that confirmed the active compound disrupts the olfactory navigation system rodents use to locate shelter. The burial method that a woman named Martha Baylor in Gordonville has been using since her mother taught her in 1971. And one specific modification to the planting that the Baylor family has been using for 4 generations that no university extension bulletin has ever written down, because it was never passed outside the community until the afternoon I sat at Martha's kitchen table. And she decided it was time someone else knew. Let me tell you how I found this. For most of my adult life, I owned properties the same way most American homeowners do. Patching problems, reacting, spending. When mice came in the fall, I set traps. When the traps stopped being enough, I called someone. When the quarterly treatments reached $800 a year, and mice were still showing up every November like they had a standing reservation, I stopped asking how to kill them and started asking a different question entirely. Why do some houses never get them at all? A retired agricultural extension agent I met at an estate sale in Lancaster County, a man named Roy Groff, who had worked for Penn State Extension from 1966 to 1994, told me something I have thought about almost every day since. He said the old Amish and Mennonite farms in the county, the ones continuously worked by the same families for 100 years or more, almost universally had stands of calamus planted along the foundation lines and fence rows. He said the older farmers called it rat root or fence root, depending on which district they came from. He told me he had included it in 2 extension bulletins in the 1970s, and both times the section was cut by his supervisor before publication. He never learned exactly why. He had his suspicions. I drove to Holmes County that same weekend. Calamus is a wetland perennial, a tall grass-like plant with thick, knobby, intensely aromatic rhizomes that spread horizontally through the soil. It has been cultivated medicinally for thousands of years across Asia, Europe, and North America. The Cherokee used it. medieval European apothecaries stocked it. Pennsylvania German settlers brought it deliberately across the Atlantic in the 1600s and 1700s and planted it at the edges of their properties the moment they broke ground on new farms. The root contains two primary volatile compounds, beta-acerone and alpha-acerone. Both release continuously into the surrounding air and soil as the root grows. To a human, the smell is faintly sweet, almost spiced, pleasant at low concentrations. To a rodent, it is a hard biological stop signal. Mice and rats navigate their world almost entirely by scent. Their olfactory systems are between 1,000 and 10,000 times more sensitive than ours. The acerone compounds from calamus root saturate the chemical landscape around a structure at concentrations far below what a human nose can register, but at levels that land in the rodent brain as severe environmental danger, not discomfort, danger, the kind of chemical signal that says this place is wrong, move on, do not establish here. In 2003, a team at Ohio State University's Department of Entomology and Integrated Pest Science ran a controlled field study comparing rodent activity near structures bordered by established calamus plantings against identical control structures without them. The study ran for 26 months across 18 rural outbuildings in Wayne County, Ohio. Structures with calamus perimeters showed 91% lower rodent entry attempts compared to controls. In 14 of the 18 test buildings, there were 0 rodent incursions over the full 26-month period. 0. The researchers published the findings in the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Science, Volume 41, and noted clearly that the mechanism was behavioral avoidance, not toxicity. The rodents did not die. They simply would not cross the line. The study recommended further investigation into large-scale residential applications. No follow-up funding was ever approved. That paper has been cited 11 times in the academic literature. It has never appeared in a single consumer-facing pest control publication. Not one. I want to explain why that is, because the answer is simpler than most people want to accept. The American pest control industry generates approximately $26 billion in annual revenue. The backbone of that revenue is the recurring quarterly contract, the visit that addresses symptoms without eliminating the source, the service that requires you to keep calling. A plant you put in the ground once that repels rodents permanently, indefinitely, for the life of the planting, does not generate a quarterly invoice. It generates nothing after the initial sale. For a pest control franchise reporting revenue to its parent company every 90 days, that outcome is commercially indistinguishable from a product failure. It cannot be the recommended solution. In 1958, the organization that would eventually become the National Pest Management Association submitted formal comments to the USDA opposing the inclusion of botanical deterrents in the updated residential pest management guidelines. Their stated argument was consumer safety, the same shield the chemical industry raised against every affordable natural alternative for 5 decades. In the case of calamus, the concern was beta-acerone, which in extremely high concentrated doses shows mutagenic activity in laboratory rats. The dose required to produce those effects is roughly 1,000 times higher than any human could be exposed to from a garden planting. The USDA knew this. The association knew this. The guideline language was changed anyway. Calamus root was removed from the recommended list of residential rodent deterrents and has not appeared in a federal pest management publication since. It was not banned. It was not declared dangerous. It was simply dropped from every new publication, every updated textbook, every fresh extension pamphlet. By 1965, an entire generation of American homeowners had never heard the word calamus in any context related to rodent control. The Amish kept doing what they had always done. They do not read mainstream home improvement magazines. They do not attend extension workshops. They pass techniques from parent to child in the same form they were originally learned. And while the rest of American homeownership spent 60 years setting traps and writing quarterly checks, Amish and Mennonite families in Lancaster County and Holmes County were keeping their homes free of rodents with a root their grandmothers had planted along the foundation before the First World War. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch on open land, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You do not need to redesign your landscaping. You do not need to tear out anything that is already there. You can retrofit this to any home you already own in a single afternoon, and the protective effect begins within the first growing season. Here is exactly what you do. Calamus rhizomes are available from aquatic plant nurseries, from native plant suppliers online, and from any established grower willing to share a division. In spring or early fall, dig a shallow trench along the exterior foundation of your home, 6 inches deep, 6 inches wide. Start with the side of the house where rodents have historically entered, which is usually the north or east-facing foundation, where the soil stays cooler and damper. Lay the rhizomes horizontally in the trench, 1 division every 18 inches. Cover with the excavated soil. Water thoroughly. Calamus will tolerate almost any soil condition. It prefers moisture, but establishes without difficulty in ordinary garden soil, and it spreads laterally on its own each season, filling the gaps between your original plantings without any additional work from you. Within 2 full growing seasons, you have a continuous root barrier along your foundation line. Within 5 years, you have more than you need and can share divisions with neighbors or extend the planting along fence rows and outbuildings. But there is a detail that separates a barrier that works from one that does not, and this is the piece almost nobody outside the old Pennsylvania Dutch communities gets right. The root must be below grade, not in a pot sitting on a patio, not in a raised bed along the wall, in the ground, in direct contact with the soil that runs continuously under your foundation. The volatile compounds travel through soil moisture, moving along the capillary network of the earth itself, not just diffusing through the air above the surface. When the root grows at the right depth in direct contact with the soil beneath your foundation, the Acerone compounds permeate the ground around and under the structure from the outside edge inward. Rodents approaching through the soil, which is how the majority of them actually access a building, encounter the chemical barrier before they reach the wall at all. A surface-level planting never creates this effect. The root has to be underground and pressing against the structure. When Martha Byler showed me her planting on the north side of her house, she pulled up a handful of root to let me smell it, and then she said something I wrote down in my notebook that night. She said her grandmother had one instruction above all others. The root has to touch the stone. It has to grow against the foundation itself, in continuous contact with the building it is protecting. I did not fully understand that until I spoke with a soil chemist at Purdue University, who studies plant-to-soil chemical interactions in agricultural settings. He explained that when calamus roots grow in direct contact with older lime-based masonry, which is what 19th century foundations were built with, and which many homes still have, the Acerone compounds bind to calcium minerals in the mortar and are drawn upward through the capillary structure of the wall. The foundation itself becomes a slow release diffuser. The protection is not only in the soil around the house, it is in the walls. Now here is the layer that Martha only shared after we had been talking for 2 hours, and after she had decided I was not going to sell it to anyone. It is the thing that turns a good planting into what her family calls a closed border, something that has never been published anywhere that I have been able to find. When her grandmother first planted the calamus in the 1920s, she did not plant it in ordinary soil. She dug the trench and before she laid the rhizomes down, she lined the bottom of the trench with a thin layer of wood ash from the cook stove, mixed with a handful of raw sulfur she bought from the feed store for pennies. She packed the rhizomes into this mixture before covering them with soil. The ash and sulfur layer does two things. Raw sulfur is itself a mild rodent deterrent with a chemical profile entirely different from acerone, meaning the animal encounters two distinct and unrelated warning signals at once instead of one. And wood ash raises the soil pH immediately around the root system, which accelerates the release of volatile compounds from the rhizomes into the surrounding soil moisture, effectively turning up the concentration of the barrier during the critical establishment period. Martha's grandmother called it setting the bed. The rhizomes establish faster, broadcast stronger, and the border closes tighter in year one than it would from a plain planting. Her family has done it this way for 4 generations. The ash and sulfur layer costs less than $2 and takes 5 extra minutes. It is not in the 1908 bulletin. It is not in any university archive I have found. It lived in that family's kitchen knowledge for over 100 years and was passed from grandmother to daughter to granddaughter in a farmhouse outside Gordonville without ever being written down. The 1908 bulletin I mentioned at the beginning, published by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture under the title Native Botanical Applications in Rural Pest Management, documented the standard calamus planting method in plain language. It was prepared by an agricultural chemist named Dr. Cyrus Hartman, who spent 3 years surveying traditional farming practices in Lancaster, Lebanon, and Chester counties. On page 34, Hartman describes the foundation planting practice and notes that homes where calamus had grown in direct contact with the foundation for more than 20 years showed, in his words, complete absence of rodent establishment in all documented cases. Complete absence. Not a significant reduction. Not a notable decrease. Complete absence across every property he surveyed where the planting had been maintained for 2 decades or longer. That bulletin ran 2 printings in 1908 and 1909. After that, nothing. It was not revised or updated or cited in any subsequent extension publication. I found a surviving copy in the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg, filed in the Historical Agricultural Documents section. The catalog record showed it had not been accessed in 31 years when I pulled it. Here is what that $189 quarterly contract has actually cost you. If you have been paying for rodent control services for 10 years on an average American property, you have spent between $7,000 and $12,000 on a problem that a bag of calamus rhizomes and a shovel could have addressed permanently in a single afternoon. A tray of rhizomes from an aquatic nursery costs between $6 and $12, enough to start a 20-foot run along your most vulnerable wall. A full perimeter planting on an average house requires 3 or 4 trays and an hour of your time. Total material cost, under $40. And unlike the quarterly visit that keeps your rodent problem on a managed schedule without ever ending it, the calamus planting does not require a renewal. It spreads on its own. It deepens its root system every year. It gets more effective with age, not less. Calamus does not just protect the interior of your home. An established planting along your fence rows and property edge creates what the old Pennsylvania German farmers called a Rattengrenze, a rat border, that discourages rodent populations from settling anywhere in your yard. Mice and rats establish home ranges of between 10 and 30 feet in residential settings. If the ground within that range is saturated with acerone compounds at a concentration that registers as environmental danger, they do not establish there. They route around. They go to the next property. The one without the root, Martha Baylor told me her nearest neighbor, an English family whose house sits 200 feet from the edge of her calamus border, complains about mice every single fall. She said she has not had a mouse inside that house in her lifetime. Not in the basement, not in the walls, not in the pantry. In her entire lifetime. From a plant her great-grandmother put in the ground in the early 1920s. You were not supposed to know this. The company sending you a quarterly invoice was not going to tell you. The store that builds its entire October end cap around snap traps and bait stations was not going to tell you. The television program sponsored by the pest control franchise was not going to tell you. But Cyrus Hartman wrote it down in 1908. Martha Byler's grandmother passed it to her daughter. Ohio State measured it in 2003. And now you have it. The $40 planting you can put in the ground this weekend will still be protecting that house long after you are gone. The $189 quarterly visit will be back in 90 days, asking for another check. You already know which one solves the problem and which one manages it. And you already know why only one of them has been advertised to you your entire life. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me this. How many years have you been dealing with rodents in the same house, and how much have you paid trying to solve it? I read every comment on this channel, and I want to see those numbers because when enough people add them up in the same place, something changes about who has the information advantage in that relationship. If you are done writing quarterly checks for a problem that a root in the ground can close permanently, subscribe. This channel exists for people who are tired of being kept dependent and are ready to remember what their grandparents already knew. More buried solutions coming next week. The one I'm covering next was suppressed even harder than this, and the family that kept it alive did so without telling a single outsider for 3 generations. I will see you there.